Mosaic, a daily news program from Link TV, presents a selection of news reports from independent and state-controlled broadcasters from throughout the Middle East.
The Coalition Provisional Authority announces that the Iraqi police have arrested Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi's aide, Omar Bazian. Zarqawi is a prime suspect accused of waging a chain of attacks in Iraq. Meanwhile, a U.S. military spokesman announces the death of 4 U.S. soldiers and the injury of 5 others when their vehicle exploded today in eastern Baghdad. These developments occur while the U.S. forces agree to a partial withdrawal from Najaf and Kufa and to transfer security affairs to the Iraqi police per their agreement with Muqtada al-Sadr. The heat of this Baghdad summer does not compare to the heat from the military operations. The U.S. forces barely recover from a catastrophe, only to be struck again by another. A number of U.S. soldiers were killed and others were wounded when their vehicle exploded in Baghdad's Sadr city. U.S. soldiers immediately enforced a security belt around the area and evacuated the wounded. According to eyewitnesses, armed individuals fired missiles at the vehicle while traveling on a two-way street in eastern Baghdad. Mediation efforts are still underway trying to vacate the U.S. and Mahdi troops from Shiite cities. Meanwhile, peace is restored in Najaf and daily life is returning to normal. Most shops and markets have reopened their doors, and as the truce continues, the city comes back to life. Ahmad Shalabi, Muqtada al-Sadr, and officials from the Shiite house have been conducting consecutive meetings at the Imam Ali Shrine in Najaf, striking an agreement between Sadr's movement and the Shiite house. The agreement requires eliminating the armed presence from Najaf and Kufa.
All sides of the conflict, the coalition forces and the Mahdi militia army, will vacate the 2 holy cities and forbid any of its members from re-entering the city. Second, the chief of police will deploy Iraqi units into the city to protect citizens and holy sites, beginning at 6 p.m. today, June 4th, 2004.
In Kufa, a Friday sermon was delivered on behalf of Muqtada al-Sadr, declaring his total rejection to the new Iraqi government. Amidst mediation efforts and this religious sermon, a demonstration was organized by the Supreme Council for the Islamic Revolution to support peace and security efforts in Shiite cities. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia promised to continue its efforts to fight terrorism. Jointly with the United States, the country froze the assets of 5 affiliates of the Haramain charity because of its links to Al-Qaeda. Meanwhile, it will establish an official agency joining all the charity organizations. There is opposition to the kingdom's latest measure to stop financing armed groups, but at the same time, some voices are rising in the United States, increasing pressure on Saudi Arabia. The Saudi announcement of the creation of one new group to supervise all charity organizations outside the country to prevent the financing of armed groups came with another announcement by the U.S. Treasury to appoint an Arab economic expert to strengthen its knowledge of Islamic charity organizations. This step and other American Saudi steps that came after the September 11th attack and other operations in the world, including the latest events in Saudi Arabia, to prevent the financing of what Washington calls terrorism. These funds can be used by Islamic institutions like banks, charity organizations, or financial companies to transfer, hide, or launder money for people who plan to carry out attacks. Saudi officials chose their embassy in the United States to explain the new measures and confront the calls by many American officials, particularly from the U.S. Treasury. The measures began with the closing down of the headquarters of the Haramain charity in the kingdom after its former president was found to be on the U.S. list of people and organizations that support terrorism. Its accounts will be taken over by the Saudi National Commission for Relief and Charity Work. All the organizations that give charity under this agency will be supervised by an official Saudi authority. It will have an administration with distinguished people in the kingdom. Every 3 months, they will submit a report about the financial support with detailed accounting information. The amount of charities will not exceed more than $100 million a year. Organizations that support the Palestinians and Kosovar civilians will also be folded into this agency.
Charity is part of our faith.
Charity is part of our faith. We do this in order to ensure that the charity of our citizens goes to those who need it, and that we know where funds go when they leave Saudi Arabia.
This comes as the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is often accused of procrastinating on fighting groups that Washington considers terrorists. John Kerry, the U.S. Democratic presidential candidate, criticized the Bush administration for cooperating with the kingdom to fight terrorism, knowing that the Saudi Security Authority killed or arrested the most leaders and members of the Al-Qaeda organization. He said that creating a new financial organization should be accompanied by reforming school curriculums to eliminate violence and hatred, in addition to training sheikhs and religious scholars not to call for incitement and hatred. Meanwhile, according to statements, Saudi scholars of various fields called on American experts, saying that the dangerous U.S. policies in Iraq on the Palestinian issue and towards Arab states serve only to increase extremism.
U.S. light crude fell 43 cents to $38.85 a barrel, following an 80-cent drop on Thursday when OPEC agreed a two-stage output increase of 2.5 million barrels a day in July and August. Prices had initially climbed sharply following the weekend's terrorist attacks in Saudi Arabia that left 22 people dead.
The Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries agreed at its gathering at the Phoenicia Intercontinental Hotel to raise output by 2 million barrels a day from July 1st. Under the two-stage pact, the oil exporters cartel promised to add a further 500,000 barrels per day from August 1st. OPEC meets again on July 21st. Kuwait said it expects a drop of $6 to $8 per barrel in the price of benchmark Brent crude oil following the Beirut talks. U.S. Energy Secretary Spencer Abraham said OPEC's decision to raise oil output and a new report showing U.S. crude stocks at the highest level in nearly 2 years are both good news for the oil market. A Saudi Arabian official separately said in Washington that the kingdom expects to see overheated global oil prices decline. U.S. crude oil futures soared to a record high of $42 a barrel on Tuesday after a deadly attack on the Saudi oil city of Al-Khubar. Saudi Arabia is the world's largest oil exporter. Crude futures fell nearly 6% to $39.96 a barrel on Wednesday and settled down on Thursday by almost 2% to $39.28 a barrel. Ali Nuaimi, oil minister of Saudi, told reporters in Beirut the decisions made here sent a very strong signal to the market. Nuaimi said the extra August increment was not negotiable on the downside and could even be altered higher. OPEC has been under enormous pressure from industrialized powers, worried about the impact of inflated energy costs on economic growth. For their own part, producers do not want prices at heights that put fuel demands at risk. Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates confirmed to reporters they would deliver about 1 million barrels daily of real extra oil in June. Libya, which remains at odds with Lebanon over the disappearance of a Shiite Muslim cleric more than 25 years ago, did not send any delegates to the OPEC meeting.
The last time OPEC leaders met in Beirut was just before the civil war erupted here. Lebanese leaders hailed the return of OPEC gatherings as a testimony of Lebanon's post-war revival. Beirut grabs the international airwaves again. World attention turned to the Lebanese capital as markets across the globe looked for a respite from surging oil prices. Members of the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, held a crucial extraordinary meeting here to boost oil supplies in a bid to reduce record high prices in the wake of terrorist attacks in Saudi Arabia. Top-notch journalists and international media networks converged on Beirut to cover the event and report on the rise of OPEC's official produce ceiling. Beirut was a favored venue for OPEC meetings before the 1975 to 1990 civil war. Its return and the pomp surrounding the conference shed light on Lebanon's post-war strides. How do you describe your return to Beirut for the first time after the war, to convene summits here and meetings?
I think it's just about time, and it's been really nice to come back to Beirut after almost 3 decades, or more than 3 decades. So we're looking forward to coming back to Beirut maybe in the near future.
How significant is it for OPEC ministers to meet right now and decide on upping and increasing oil production at the time of Middle East volatility, at a time when there's panic in the markets?
Well, OPEC organization needs to come up with a good decision to cool off the prices, to calm the market, and of course to bring sanity to the market.
Lebanese Premier Rafik Hariri spearheaded efforts to convene the Vienna-based organization's meeting in Beirut and suggested moving OPEC's headquarters to Lebanon.
Lebanon is located at crossroads between major producers in the Gulf and major consumers in the West. Lebanon has always served as a regional service and trade hub. The Arab Summit and the Francophone Summit, among other major international and regional events that Beirut hosted during the last 2 years, are but a sign of Lebanon's revival. Your conference is yet another strong signal in the same direction.
A number of international and regional organizations have been moving to Beirut, which has been restoring its pre-war role as a Middle East economic, cultural, and entertainment center. The OPEC meeting was the latest in a string of back-to-back summits and gatherings that have been taking place here. The Lebanese welcomed them as a sign of confidence in this country's post-war stability and development. Mahal Hefeki, Future Television in Beirut.
Pope John Paul has called for the rapid return of Iraq's sovereignty during a meeting with U.S. President George Bush at the Vatican. A year after the U.S. President snubbed the Pope, who opposed the war on Iraq, the frail pontiff spoke tough against the unrest in the country and for the participation of the international community in what happens in Iraq after it was sidelined by the unilateral invasion. In an indirect reference to a scandal over U.S. troops' abuse of Iraqi prisoners, the Pope said that the recent deplorable events have troubled the civic and religious conscience of all. The Pope also said that the threat of international terrorism remains a source of constant concern. Bush responded by trying to reassure the pontiff that his government would work for what he called human liberty and dignity, but made no direct mention of Iraq or the prisoners' abuse scandal that angered the Vatican.
I also bring a message from my government that says to you, sir, we will work for human liberty and human dignity in order to spread peace and compassion. That we appreciate the strong symbol of freedom that you have stood for. And we recognize the power of freedom to change societies and to change the world.
If the Pope piled pressure on Bush over Iraq beyond the walls of the Vatican, voices against the president's policies were as vocal. At various sites around the Italian capital, Rome, activists took to the streets, protesting against Bush's visit. Though the visit was timed to commemorate the liberation of Rome by Allied forces in World War II, protesters were angered by the actions of the new generation of U.S. soldiers in Iraqi prisons. Authorities have said they will allow peaceful protests, but deployed some 10,000 police who were out in full force around the city. Despite their government's military involvement in Iraq, the overwhelming majority of Italians opposed the war, as well as the occupation, and a year ago, Rome was the scene of a million-person protest. Iraqis want a say, but how much of a say? Iraq's Foreign Minister Hoshyar Zebari told the UN Security Council that his interim government should have the right to decide how long U.S.-led troops stay in the country, but his demand fell short of an outright veto on the troops' operations, an idea floated by the British Prime Minister early this week. Zebari also refused to set a departure date for the troops demanded by some members of the Security Council. Still, he said he wanted some unspecified changes in a U.S.-British draft resolution on Iraq's future to underscore sovereignty in the security, administrative, and economic fields when the U.S. occupation formally ends on June 30th.
We seek a new and an unambiguous resolution that underlines the transfer of full sovereignty to the people of Iraq and their representatives. This resolution must mark a clear departure from previous UN Security Council resolutions 1483 and 1511 that legitimized the occupation of our country. By removing the level of occupation, we will deprive the terrorist and anti-democratic forces of a rallying point to foment violence in our country. We expect that the resolution endorses a genuine and comprehensive transfer of power on June 30th. This means investing full authority in the interim government to run Iraq's affairs, make its own decision, and have authority over Iraq's security matters. This transfer of sovereignty must also authorize the interim government to control, administer, and manage Iraq's resources and assets.
Director of Palestinian Passages in the Gaza Strip, Salim Abu Safia, said on Monday that the Israeli occupation forces are still imposing a strict closure on the Strip's passages and crossings, where they are barring access to a large number of agricultural merchandise and goods, as well as foodstuff, medical supplies, and tents provided by Algeria, Morocco, and Qatar as an aid for the Rafah refugee camp. Palestinian sources announced recently that the IOF intends to reopen the Strip's trade passages of Beit Hanun and Dilmantar on Monday, as well as reopening the southern Rafah Travelers Passage. Abu Safia in return asserted that the IOF are still holding a tight grip on these passages, refuting Israeli reports that the Israeli military siege imposed on the Strip was lifted. The IOF has imposed tight closures on the Strip since the beginning of May, where tons of agricultural products and other goods have been stocked in these passages. The UN's Agency for Palestinian Refugees, the UNRWA, launched Monday a multi-million-dollar appeal to help hundreds of families made homeless by the Israeli army's mass campaign of house destructions in Rafah. Part of the anticipated aid will help repair sewage and water networks, telephone and electricity poles, and as well as cables. Hansard said access to drinking water was problematic in Rafah and could potentially pose a serious health hazard. UNRWA is currently providing safe water in tankers. Around 60 Palestinians were killed and 300 homes housing 710 families destroyed in Rafah last month as Israel launched a massive operation there. Hundreds of children held on Monday a march, which was called by the Palestinian Juniors Parliament based in Rafah City. It was meant to express their solidarity with the children and families who lost their houses and beloved ones during the latest Israeli brutal incursion into the city. The march was launched from Al-Auda Square in the heart of the city and headed to Al-Barazil neighborhood, which was one of the most affected areas due to the large-scale military attacks. The marchers held Palestinian flags and banners denouncing the Israeli military killings against children in Rafah and the international community's silence toward these massacres. The children then gathered on the rubble of tens of demolished houses in the neighborhood and chanted slogans for providing international protections for the Palestinian people. Families of prisoners and detainees held Monday their weekly sit-in strike in front of the premises of the Red Cross in Gaza, in solidarity with their sons inside the Israeli prisons. The families renewed their call to the international community to intervene immediately to rescue their sons.
The Iranian nation commemorated the 15th anniversary since the founder of the Iranian Islamic Republic, Imam Khomeini, passed away. Hundreds of thousands of Iranians flooded the streets, heading toward his shrine to commemorate his memory. The following is a synopsis of the Khomeini's life.
It
has been 15 years since the founder of the Iranian Islamic Republic, Imam Khomeini, passed away, peace be upon him. During the 80 years of his life, he managed to gain a lot of knowledge and religious education. But his biggest achievement was a decisive confrontation with injustice and oppression. In the early 1960s, he gave his first speech, criticizing the arrogant policies of America and Israel, which compelled people to demonstrate. At the time, this was enough reason for the Shah authorities to arrest him. However, public pressure amid injustices that the people were facing at the Shah's era, he had no alternative but to release Khomeini and expel him to Turkey. Then he went to Iraq, and in particular to the holy city of Najaf, which became the center of the revolution's leadership. Using cassette tapes, Khomeini delivered his speeches to the Iranian nation. The revolution reached its climax when the ousted Shah collaborated with the ousted Iraqi president to keep Khomeini away from the nation. At the time, Kuwait refused to give him a visa, forcing him to flee to a French village where he continued working to topple the Shah regime. He lived there until he came back to the land of his birth, establishing the first Muslim state in modern history. People loved the late Imam, who had a unique personality. His funeral was larger than the crowds of people who welcomed him at the Mehrabad airport upon his return from Paris. His ideas moved the Muslim and international world. One Westerner researcher described this influence to a European television, saying, "The man who stood up for the world's superpowers died, but his actual war with these powers has not begun yet." 2 days after the Khobar incident, clashes erupted. The development of these events impacts Saudi Arabia and are also reflected by the unprecedented increase of the international oil prices, particularly affecting Asian countries.
Some believe that the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is determined to enforce strict security measures in the country. Meanwhile, others believe that the security situation is slipping through the Saudi authorities' fingers. Regardless of the 2 points of view, dramatic developments are arising in the kingdom. Barely recovering from one armed attack, they were struck by another, this time at checkpoints. The Saudi authorities are emphasizing the lack of victims in an attempt to draw attention away from the Khobar incident. However, photographs of the shopping mall where it occurred brought the issue of security back to the front pages. Blood splattered here and there and bullets scattered all over. Meanwhile, reports abound of the deal made between Saudi security forces and the assailants, allowing them to escape in exchange for ending the confrontation. This was the topic of discussion among many. However, there was a strong impact on the international petroleum markets, where oil prices have been rising to levels unseen except during periods of war.
There are a number of highly vulnerable points in the present petroleum industry, such as the pipelines and oil installations, that are the cause of concern, no matter how minor. Can you imagine the reaction of the market if there had been a large attack?
The interdependent factors of fear and attacks can still be controlled. This is more or less what occurred in the wake of the Khobar attack. But what would happen in the case of a much larger attack?
The New York Times newspaper apologized to readers for giving them inaccurate information about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. The newspaper published an article titled with bold letters, "Sorry, we were completely wrong about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq." The editor admitted that some of the reports that were published in the newspaper were not sufficiently convincing, saying that the newspaper's editors should have verified the information that they received. The newspaper also blamed Ahmed Chalabi and his Iraqi friends who were exiled at the time, accusing them of providing the U.S. administration and the newspaper with inaccurate information about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Dr. Mustafa, when we read these news reports in the New York Times, which is the most read newspaper in the United States, what kind of evaluations can we make about the credibility and level of seriousness in journalism and the ability of the newspaper to influence the political process in the United States and the American public?
Frankly, we must go back many months before the occupation campaign was launched on Iraq. At the time, there was a new phenomena called embedded journalism. American and British military forces were accompanied by a number of journalists who did not know anything about the war, except what they were told by the military commander. This situation is still relevant. The embodied journalism expanded in such a way that the American media still serves the American policymakers. I do not think that the New York Times, who established itself at this level of journalism, wasn't actually aware of what was happening and of the justifications that were fabricated to occupy Iraq.
من الأسباب والمبررات لاحتلال العراق. يعني في ألف باء الصحافة العربية أو الأمريكية أنه يجب
The fundamental principle of both the Arab and Western journalists is the importance of verifying the accuracy of the information from at least 2 or 3 independent sources. When the newspaper says in its apology that it based its reports on Chalabi and other exiled Iraqis, this means that it depended only on one group of Iraqis. Shouldn't that affect its credibility? Doesn't this newspaper care about its credibility?
ألا تخشى على مصداقيتها في المستقبل؟
I think that a big part of the American media are used to serving political objectives. Even this news report, which comes amid the campaign that was launched by the American administration against Dr. Ahmed Chalabi. Why wasn't this report published a week or 2 weeks ago? This news report is just a part of the American administration's political campaign.
Mosaic is made possible by a grant from the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, which promotes journalism excellence worldwide and invests in the vitality of 26 U.S. communities, and the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. Additional support is provided by the Firedoll Foundation and Henry and Virgilia Dakin